Israel plans to defend itself at the top court of the United Nations against allegations of engaging in genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. This comes after South Africa initiated the case at the International Court of Justice, asserting that the extent of death, destruction, and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza qualifies as genocide under international law. The request from South Africa seeks an order for Israel to cease its attacks in Gaza. Despite Israel's unusual dismissal of international cases as unfair, its decision to respond indicates concerns about potential damage to its reputation. On Monday, Israel said it was withdrawing thousands of troops from other areas in a potential shift away from the massive air and ground operations that have devastated Gaza.
Israeli government spokesperson Eli Levy had this to say in response to South Africa.
The State of Israel emphatically condemns South Africa's decision to play advocate for the devil and to make itself criminally complicit with the perpetrators of the October 7 massacre. On October 7, South Africa openly aligned itself with the Hamas rapist regime when it blamed Israel for Hamas's violation of the ceasefire and covered up Hamas's crimes against humanity. It is now aiding and abetting that machinery of genocide. Collaborating with the perpetrators of genocide is, alas, not new to South Africa, which backed Omar al-Bashir after he was indicted for genocide in Darfur.
However, international law expert Francis Boyle told Democracy Now! That South Africa has a strong case. Let's watch.
Based on my careful review of all the documents so far submitted by the Republic of South Africa, I believe South Africa will win an order against Israel to cease and desist from committing all acts of genocide against the Palestinians. And then we will have an official determination by the International Court of Justice itself, the highest legal authority in the United Nations system, that genocide is going on. And under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, all contracting parties, 153 states, will then be obliged, quote, to prevent, unquote, the genocide by Israel against the Palestinians.
Meanwhile, in the Red Sea, Iran deployed its Al-Borz destroyer into the Red Sea just one day after the U.S. targeted and killed 10 Houthi fighters who are attacking commercial vessels in the disputed waters that separate Africa from the Middle East.
Joining us now to discuss is Palestinian-American political analyst Omar Baddar. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start by getting into the implications of the charges South Africa is making against Israel in this international criminal court. I know that some folks have been pushing for this specifically, unlike the United States. This is one of these rare exceptions where Israel is party to certain treaty obligations where it can be brought to justice before a court like this. What is likely to be the outcome here, given that there is some real possibility for accountability?
Yeah, look, the case on merits, there's no question that Israel is guilty of exactly what's being charged. I mean, it's quite plain for anybody who wants to see. We have this pretense, I think, particularly in mainstream American media, that Israel is engaged in a war against Hamas and that Palestinian civilian casualties are essentially collateral damage. And there's this big debate about whether, is Israel doing enough to protect them or not, or whatever. But in reality, this is actually a war against the civilian population in Gaza. They are the intended target of Israel's bombardment. It's quite clear when you look at the extent of the devastation, the genocidal rhetoric that Israeli leaders have used, at documents that revealed that, people who are actively involved in these operations talking about the fact that the strategy is to induce a shock and a level of despair among the civilian population, and watching that play out in the fact that Israel is bombing safe areas, designating certain areas as safe zones for people to go, and then dropping massive bombs on them. What's quite clear here is that Israel is trying to make Gaza unlivable for the Palestinian population, and that absolutely fits the definition of genocide. And you look at the rates at which Palestinian children are being killed, journalists are being killed, medics, UN workers, everything is off the charts. This is not a normal war, quote unquote war. The only problem, though, at the end of the day is that even if we do get the justice that we want out of this process, ultimately it's going to be you and what army is going to really hold Israel accountable. Because as long as Israel holds the backing of the United States that is completely unconditional militarily, diplomatically, and in every other way, then it looks like Israel will be largely able to avoid accountability anyway. And the best case scenario here, which is not negligible, I think it will still be obviously a useful thing, to increase the diplomatic isolation of Israel globally as a result of engaging in this genocidal violence against Palestinians in Gaza.
I mean, you say this is not a normal war, but it looks very normal to me. The Israeli government is destroying buildings. I mean, in the course of, in World War II, we leveled Japanese city after Japanese city. We firebombed Tokyo even before the bomb was used. We destroyed city after city in Germany. It does look like conventional warfare with, unfortunately, a tremendous amount of collateral damage given the densely populated area and everything. And I do think we should discuss ways to limit civilian casualties, and you could certainly fault the Israeli government for not doing enough on that front. But in what way is this not normal? This is just what warfare looks like, and we're not as accustomed to it as we used to be.
Look, I mean, certainly one can say that the way we used to do warfare in the past was a lot more brutal than it is today. But there is an added element here, is that this is not the goal of this war is to bring Palestinians down to their knees and to accept to live as a prisoner population into perpetuity. That's the fundamental reality. These comparisons that get made about Japan and Germany and whatever else, the idea was to achieve a military victory in order to then allow room for those countries to actually develop and thrive and for the populations to have a prospect for a better future. This is not at all Israel's plan for Gaza. The idea is to bring them down to their knees and to pummel them into submission. And then from there, the goal is to basically just have them live in squalor or drive them out. Ethnic cleansing is effectively what they're trying to do. So no, this is not a normal war by any stretch of the imagination. It's not just the rate of killing that we're witnessing that dwarfs anything else that we've seen in the last 20 years. When you look at Russia's onslaught in Ukraine, killing nearly 500 children in the entire first year, which everybody recognizes as pretty significant, massive, and indiscriminate, and yet Israel has killed more than 10,000 Palestinian children in the course of 3 months. Something here can't honestly fit the definition of normal, and I think it's a scale of a crime that does merit these charges being brought about genocidal intent and action in Gaza.
Well, but to compare the two, I mean, Russia is not trying to overthrow the Ukrainian government. It's trying to make independent or seize for itself some of the territory of the country at borders, where Israel is trying to eliminate the regime of the disputed territory, Hamas. And given the tremendous difficulty in doing that, I mean, you might even say it's impossible and they should stop trying and we should come to some other objective in Gaza. But they're undertaking a project that the Russian government has not declared for Ukraine.
Robbie, just for starters, I think we should be clear about the fact that this is not disputed territory. It is occupied territory. The only people disputing the status of the territories is basically Israel. Occupied territories, Israel does not have the right to defend an occupation. It has the right to, quote unquote, defend itself. But Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself in an occupation any more than a home intruder breaking into some place with a gun has the right to claim self-defense against the people living in that home. The reality is Israel has been imposing a suffocating siege on top of the Gaza Strip that has made life very difficult for people living there. Palestinians in Gaza before October 7th were not allowed to have an airport, not allowed to have a seaport, not allowed to trade with the outside world, where unemployment was at 50%, where people had no prospect for a better future for their children. And they were told you have to live that way under permanent Israeli siege and apartheid until the end of time. And that is simply unacceptable. And if there is then a terrorist attack as a result of Israeli policies that have been suffocating the Palestinian populations and denying them their most basic rights for decade after decade, Israel doesn't get to just engage in this genocidal violence against the civilian population in the name of trying to change their government. And change their government to what? Another pliant government that is then going to put up with permanent Israeli siege and occupation? The situation is untenable. If our rhetoric about believing in freedom and human rights means anything, it has to demand not just an end to the current onslaught in Gaza. Ceasefire is an incredibly tepid demand. It is ultimately about holding Israel accountable for its decades of siege and occupation and suffocation of the people in Gaza and the endless war crimes they've committed against them that are frankly worse than October 7th, even before October 7th, in terms of successive Israeli massacres, dropping prohibited weapons on top of people in Gaza, killing children by the hundreds. That is not a status quo that anybody can put up with. And then to say that the aggressors have the right to engage in even greater massacres in order to change the political reality in the Palestinian territories is not morally defensible by any stretch of the imagination.
I think it's also worth noting that some of the comparisons that keep getting brought up about warfare prior to World War II, it's notable that we have to go back that far because after World War II is when our international humanitarian law framework was created in order to shift away from the barbarity that was commonplace to war before that period. And that's the whole point of the United Nations and various international law frameworks that very specifically make the kinds of behavior that we've seen in Gaza, the dropping of white phosphorus, the collective punishment of denying food and power and fuel and those kinds of life-sustaining things against international law. Before we go, Omar, I want to ask you to respond to Mr. Levy's comments. He specifically, I noted, characterized the Palestinians or Hamas, I don't want to mischaracterize him there, as having a rapist government. And I wanted you to give you an opportunity to respond to the way that those kinds of claims have been leveraged by Israel in the last few weeks, perhaps to justify the ongoing bombardment of the people of Gaza.
Yeah, it is completely distasteful demagoguery, and it's quite transparent. Obviously, sexual violence does happen in war, in acts of terrorism, in many other situations. And the Israeli military has quite a significant record of it as well, starting with the founding of the State of Israel, in which Palestinian women were subjected to rape by militias that were ethnically cleansing Palestinian areas to create the State of Israel. So this kind of rhetoric, honestly, it's reprehensible and distasteful, and is obviously just an attempt to cover for the ongoing atrocities that Israel is actually engaging with itself right now. That's the reality, is that anybody who looks at any atrocities that were committed by Palestinian militants against Israeli civilians, they're universally condemned. And the problem right now is that we live in an atmosphere and a climate in which Israeli atrocities against Palestinian civilians, the weaponized starvation and thirst of an entire population, and the spreading of disease and the indiscriminate bombardment is actually defended by our government. That is the fundamental problem here. And this is simply an effort to deflect from far greater atrocities that the Israeli military is currently and actively committing. And frankly, nobody should fall for it. Obviously, every person of conscience should condemn any acts of violence of any sort against civilians anywhere. But ultimately, the Israeli military knows very, very well that there isn't anything particularly unique about violence from Palestinians. They know that, in fact, literally every single kind of violence, anything that you could say about Hamas having committed against Israelis, Israel has committed against Palestinians at a far, far greater scale. And if, again, this sounds provocative and inflammatory, perhaps, but it's actually technically true. If we define terrorism as violence against civilians in order to achieve political ends, then there's no question that the largest terrorist organization in all of Palestine and Israel is, in fact, the Israeli government, and that its military wing, which is known as the Israeli military, is guilty of war crimes on a scale that we have never seen in that region. And if we're going to be serious about standing up to war crimes and crimes against humanity and atrocities of all kinds, it starts with accountability for the Israeli military, which receives unconditional military funding from the United States and unconditional diplomatic protection that simply is at odds with the values that we claim to hold about freedom, equality, and human rights.
You just said it was distasteful to, reprehensible, I believe, to call Hamas a rapist organization, and then you subsequently called the State of Israel just that. It sounds like you're saying, I think you explicitly said, Israel's crimes on this front are worse than Hamas's. Does that mean you accept the reporting from the New York Times, or you disbelieve it, about the widespread sexual violence that occurred on October 7th that was perpetrated by Hamas fighters? The New York Times citing the conditions of the bodies, women being held at the music festival and other ways found in horrific conditions, their underwear taken, that kind of thing. It's reprehensible to call Hamas a rapist organization for that?
This is, Robbie, just for clarity's sake, the Israeli government has engaged in very extensive lying about what actually took place on October 7th. We know that for an absolute fact. Now, there is certainly quite possible that sexual violence had been committed. There are some indications that, in fact, it has. There is no indication that it had been systemic or that it was basically ordered. It was not a deliberate strategy that was set from the beginning. There's certainly a very likely possibility that individual acts of sexual violence had actually been committed. But to use that to try to describe Hamas as worse than ISIS and a rapist government and whatever, coming from a government whose atrocities are far greater, is plain hypocrisy, pure and simple. That is simply the point. And the reality of the matter is that what are we talking about here ultimately? Is it about what each individual thinks about any particular crime and what words we use and whatnot? Or is it about trying to achieve a better outcome and a better future? And if we're focused actually about being helpful and producing a better outcome, then we have to look at the fundamental driving causes of violence of all sorts. And the fundamental driving cause is Israel's occupation that has gone on for decade after decade, denying Palestinians their freedom and any prospect for a better future. It's really no different than looking at what happened during apartheid in South Africa. The fact that the ANC was committing atrocities and blowing up civilian areas is no different than any situation of oppression in the history of the entire world, where sometimes the oppressed engage in acts of violence that are distasteful and indefensible. But people of conscience who are serious about trying to produce a better future and putting an end to this kind of violence need to start with the driving causes and allowing the government that is driving this violence by pursuing policies that ensure that we're going to see violence perpetuate in forever, effectively, to allow them to try to control the narrative and use inflammatory language to describe the atrocities of the oppressed, but not their own greater atrocities, is something that we ought to reject.
Omar Baddar, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.